we had a large number of different challenges in how do we deal with social media, particularly free speech versus the business model, the business model is doing the right thing. So let me see a little bit of background and then offer a couple of possible ideas on how we might address some of these challenges, okay? So one you might be familiar with was, well, about 4 years ago was an insurrection. So social media has been implicated in US insurrection based on false claims of election fraud. If you're international, Brazilians experienced exactly the same thing a year later. There was an insurrection based on false claims of election fraud. But it's not restricted to Brazil. UK had riots based on false claims of immigrant stabbings of children. Now, it's not the stabbings didn't happen, they did, but it was a native Brit that did them, not an immigrant. That's another interesting example of that. Or also implicated in the Rohingya massacre under false claims of Muslim takeover. There's another challenge in that case. What are we going to do about these things? Are the business models promoting this or not? The United States, well, actually, I'll give you a little bit more summary on it. So social media has been implicated in insurrections, riots, lynching, money laundering, suicide, sex trafficking, drug trafficking, child exploitation, judicial intimidation, terrorist recruiting. The wonderful observation at the end, Yuval Noah Harari, is social media really connecting us in ways that bring us together. Why is everyone so angry? So interesting. And it's not just the United States, it seems to be internationally. A lot of different countries are dealing with this. In the United States, this has reached the level of the Supreme Court. Many of you may have heard either the Gonzalez v. Google case or maybe the Twitter v. Tamna case. The facts underlying the cases are basically the same, in that ISIS engaged in a number of terrorist shootings in Paris and actually assassinated a woman, Rahima Gonzalez. They also were engaged in a number of shootings in Istanbul and wound up in the assassination of Nawaz al-Assad. And so the families sued on the basis that the algorithms were helping to promote and bring these groups together, and maybe the platforms would bear some responsibility in this. And so in some cases, the Supreme Court's found this challenging and pushed it back to lower courts, but is so far largely siding with the platforms. Another set of cases are actually, so that's leaving the platforms free to choose what they carry and what they don't carry. The flip side is actually on the net choice v. Paxson and net choice v. Moody, Moody v. net choices. These are Florida and Texas cases, trying to restrict the platform's ability to moderate content. It's kind of the opposite direction. This came up from conservatives in those states following the deplatforming of Donald Trump after the last election, or the fears that their voices were being suppressed. Many of you may know after Musk brought Twitter, released the Twitter files and said that there was suppression of conservative voices on this. So can platforms discriminate against viewpoints, or can platforms ban politicians or journalists? There's another way to do that. And this is not just in the United States. Brazil banned Twitter, or blocked it for a little while, for Elon Musk's failure to comply with judicial inquiries about misbehavior and death threats against judges. And also France arrested the CEO of Telegram, Pavel Durov, for money laundering and criminal activity and supporting hate speech in France. So it's a ubiquitous problem. Interestingly enough, this is also a hard problem from the political perspective. So the conservatives are unhappy with their voices being suppressed. You'd think they want to take less down. The liberals are unhappy because not enough is being taken down. How do you deal with that paradox? It's not an easy problem because there are good arguments on both sides. So I don't necessarily agree with them, but the platforms are arguing, and as they have, it is almost impossible to filter 500 messages a day and not catch one. Or if they are in fact held accountable, then won't it chill speech because they might take down too much activity, not too little. Or it's like, take the other set of cases. What about the viewpoint discrimination? Consider the case of net choice v. Paxson and net choice v. Moody. What constitutes viewpoint discrimination? Is it liberal versus conservative bias? What about pro-ISIS activity? What about Putin's speech? He's not a voter or sovereign, so why would he actually have a right at all? But then take it, suppose it's a citizen who's arguing on behalf of Putin. They do have the right. Is that something that could be discriminated against? Or what about the monopoly problem? The three largest platforms in the West are controlled by a single firm, Meta? Or do we want anyone to avoid sanctions by running for office, or how can platforms have no recourse if individuals blatantly and repeatedly violate the terms of service? How do we navigate those trade-offs? Here, notice, as they have argued, the top half is a publisher with editorial rights, and the bottom half, they're arguing, no, 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 we're not the publisher, you're producing the content. Externals are parties are producing the content, so we're not liable. Interestingly enough, this is an old debate. Matter of fact, the platforms want the best of both. On the one hand, they want the common carrier protection. This is like AT&T. In this case, the common carrier rule is you have to carry everyone's speech. You can't keep anyone off. But then you're not liable if someone uses the telephone to do terrorist recruiting on top. At the same time, there are the publishers. So the platforms want publishers' editorial rights. Many of the most famous Supreme Court cases are run by third-party ads that had errors in them, and the platforms are liable. Print and broadcast are liable if they run ads for terrorist recruiting. Platforms are not under Section 230, but platforms want the best of both. They want freedom from liability, and they want the editorial rights, even though print and broadcast do not have that discretion. There's another reason why this is a problem. How many of you have heard that Joe Biden dropped out of the election? Well, the moment he did so, interest in the Kamala Harris campaign exploded, and the millions of folks tried to follow her account. Interestingly enough, it was thought as bot activity unsolicited, so Twitter blocked Harris access to her followers at that point. What happened is that Jerry Nadler then asked the Senate to look into it, and this turned out to have been a technological mistake on that. But what's interesting is if you take the platforms at face value with full editorial rights, they would have the right to engage in that activity. This is a direct quote from Elon Musk. And in fact, if he wanted to, he could cut Harris off from her followers on the basis of that editorial right for publishers. You could undo freedom of assembly. In my view, that is not only wrong from a free speech perspective, but it's also wrong from a freedom of assembly perspective. The legal theory upon which this is based is actually the Supreme Court decision in Hurley, actually a case out of Boston, really interesting. In this case, for St. Patrick's Day parade, the Massachusetts had ruled you can't discriminate. Massachusetts was trying to do the right thing. But the court ruled they didn't have to include a gay rights group, Pride, on the basis that it was imposing a viewpoint. They would have to then, as the organizers, would be putting forward a view that was not their own. And so that would violate their rights of free speech. This, social media argue, then means as organizers, they can't be forced to carry speech. This is their response to the Paxton and other arguments, okay? Now the question is, which metaphor should we in fact use? Do we use the publisher metaphor? Do we use the common carrier metaphor? Or perhaps another? Consider this very case. Now, what I want to do is I want to give you two different ideas. The first is to reinterpret Hurley, what I think is a more helpful metaphor, as a city. Social media don't have viewpoints. They are not the producers of content. Who produces it? You and I produce that content. Users are not online to hear from Facebook or from Telegram. They're there to hear from other users. Likewise, influencers are not there to influence Facebook or Telegram. They're there to influence their followers, if you will. In my view, properly interpreted, social media are the traffic cops and sanitation engineers. Literally, what they do is if you view them as a city, like the parade in Hurley, what they do is they issue warnings, remove bad drivers, and clean up the mess. Under that metaphor, you see it as a city. Cities cannot censor citizens. Citizens should be free to hear from whom they wish and speak to whom they choose. That would be restoring listener rights under a different metaphor. I'll give you a second idea. The second interpretation is, let us suppose we raise total immunity to a flow rate of pollution. Don't recognize misinformation simply as a true-false problem, but as a pollution problem. That gives us another set of tools grounded in kind of externality economics. In this case, think about it. We can use statistical sampling. You can then actually check the flow rate of pollution, of dioxin, of carbon dioxide, as we do in a particular medium. Here, think about it. A doctor doesn't check your cholesterol by taking all your blood. He or she takes a statistical sample. It's really simple in that case. If you want 90% accuracy, 95, 99.9999% accuracy, take a bigger statistical sample and hold them accountable for that. Notice this also is a social dial, so that different societies can weight false positives and false negatives for unprotected illegal speech differently. Hate speech is legal in the United States. It's not legal in France and Germany, but you could still hold platforms accountable for illegal speech. So if we take those two ideas, here is the regulatory proposal. 3 things. First, give listeners their own rights. Users gain the right to choose their own filters on any social media where you choose whom you follow. By this, you could choose on Facebook or Instagram or Telegram to choose a filter by BBC or New York Times or Breitbart or Fox as your own choosing. Notice, so this gives, you can choose whom you follow now. Filters become liable for amplifying any illegal content above a certain threshold or flow rate. Note, this focuses only on unprotected speech, things outside First Amendment protection. Filters have publisher privileges. You can actually keep it clean, remove the hate speech, be family friendly, or you could have guns, you could have hate speech, you could have other things on there based on the filter. Social media infrastructure supporting a marketplace of filters then gain common carrier protection. Then they would not be liable as a solution for that. Here are the implications as a result of those interventions and changes to the laws on Section 230 protecting platforms. First, speakers can say anything that's legal. Content remains discoverable on your own profile page. Conservatives could say whatever they want, free of any kind of censorship. Listeners, because they can hear or not hear what they wish, choose by the filter, get to exclude even harassment. So it doesn't have to reach the other side based on the set of filters that you have chosen. Notice, this also solves the clipping Harris followers problem. Musk can't cut Harris off from people that want to hear her. It solves the freedom of assembly problem. Also, someone is always liable for illegal content above a toxicity flow rate. Print and broadcast already are. This just reconciles social media compared to print and broadcast. Editorial rights and responsibilities are clear and fair across print, broadcast, and social media. So if you have editorial rights, you also have liabilities for carrying terrorist content, but we do it on a flow rate basis as opposed to individual message basis. Lastly, interestingly enough, consider the business models themselves. Newspapers and broadcast could enter the filter market. New York Times, BBC could offer their own filters on Facebook or Telegram and re-enter and recapture some subscription or ad-based model in the social media that we don't presently have, which also helps to address the monopoly problem. So that's the possible set of ideas on how to go after this particular challenge. So I'm thrilled to take any kind of critique or any kind of help I can get.
Fantastic. Questions?
Hi, so tools such as Instagram right now, in the comment section, I've noticed that there are different comments people get to see now based on, I think, some sort of filter. So what do you think about this difference in almost what we get, like people being more kind of segmented into different?
So you've asked in some sense, how do you deal with the filter bubble problem? So I'll turn it back to you. Do you want a solution to all the world's problems in 12 minutes? That's a little bit more challenging. We actually have a mechanism for dealing with that. There's another set of issues. Matter of fact, if you're free for a talk on Wednesday, I can actually provide the details. But the insight is, in addition to number 2 there, listeners gain the right to hear or not hear, we also need to then introduce a right for speakers to be heard. I'll actually ask you a question. Under the US First Amendment, which is the strongest in the world, do you have a right to be heard? The fact is you do not. You have a right to speak. You do not at present have a right to be heard. So what we do is actually use some cozy economics to give you a right to be heard, but use it only on condition you use it in a responsible way, accepting liability for misuse of your right. So it's balancing speakers' rights and listeners' rights, which should give you a right to pierce filter bubble, conditional on exercising your right responsibly. Okay? There's another paper, Fake News and the Free Speech Problem, that addresses that specific question. It's a very good question, very hard problem.
Andre? Just a clarification on the clarification and then question on the filter.
Mhm.
So I love the idea of marketplace for filters. So on the marketplace for filters, how exactly does it work? I just need to understand this carefully. So I love it. So I'm a third party. I want to provide a filter on Facebook. How does that work exactly?
So filter, you have to create the equivalent of an app store for filters. And so Facebook, in order to offer the filter, you have two components. You have an infrastructure component. Facebook is going to have a filter component. And in order for it would be fair, reasonable, non-discriminatory terms between Facebook's own filter and any other filters so offered on that marketplace.
So I understand that part. That's why I love that part. It's like what I don't understand is like if I'm a third party filter providers, how exactly, like what exactly am I doing?
So you,
And what's the business model associated with it?
so as a third-party filter provider, you would offer your filter on that marketplace in the exact same manner that Facebook offered its filter in that marketplace. Your business model, either you get to choose ads, because now the Disney group might subset itself, or the hunting and licensing group might subset itself. The targeting gets really easy for ads when that happens. Or you could be BBC and you could charge subscriptions. It's entirely up to you. The filter would then owe a fraction of its revenues to the infrastructure, pay for the infrastructure. So you can run either the ad or subscription model based on user choice.
So the point is, I'm a subscriber. I subscribe to, let's say it's New York Times, right? They run a filter. They create there's a New York Times filter. So I'm a subscriber on Twitter, and I have my filter. That means I have to get people to subscribe to my filter, which means they get posts from Twitter through the New York Times filter.
So you would use the New York Times filter on the Twitter infrastructure using APIs to include or exclude other sources that you have chosen to follow through that filter. And you could use intersection or union of any combination of those filters.
and they will be responsible.
And they would be
If I
responsible.
subscribe to your filter, you're responsible.
That's correct. That's correct.
Great. Well, thanks again, Marshall. Fantastic. Appreciate it.